Welcome. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We're just going to wait a couple more seconds to make sure everybody is logged in and ready for this webinar. Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar, The Remains of Assyrian Identity, Ancestral Connections and Archaeological Exclusions in Post-Conflict Scenarios with Dr. Daniel Tower and Dr. Helen Malko. I'm Alexandra, the Executive Director at the nonprofit organization Assyrian Studies Association. Our mission is to promote the academic study of the Assyrian heritage through supporting research, teaching, and intellectual collaboration among scholars in various fields from around the globe. Before we begin this webinar, I would like to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, Assyrian Foundation of America and iStorage, for their support, our generous donors who made programming like this possible, and lastly, would like to thank our attendees for joining us today. I would also like to mention that if you have any questions for our speakers, please refer to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and questions will be entertained after the presentation. Now I would like to introduce our speakers for today, who are joining us from Amman, Jordan, and Sydney, Australia. Helen Malko received her PhD from Stony Brook University and a master's degree from Baghdad University. She is an anthropological archaeologist with training in cultural heritage preservation and museum practices. She is also the board of director at Assyrian Studies Association and an associate director at the American Center of Research in Amman, Jordan. Her research is focused on archaeology of the Near East, as well as the destruction of monuments and historical landscapes in Iraq and its impact on the local communities, including the Assyrians. Other areas of her scholarly interests include cultural representation of Iraqi museums and ideas of historical consciousness and cultural exchange. Daniel Tower is an academic and researcher whose work focuses on the interaction between an anthropology of religion and the geography of conflict. Daniel completed his PhD at the University of Sydney in the Department of Studies in Religion. His doctoral thesis investigated the territoriality of religious violence during the rise of ISIS in northern Iraq, through which he created a novel spatial methodology to assess ethnic and religious diversiveness, using ArcGIS map technologies. Alongside his academic research, Daniel works as a civil engineer specializing in bridge construction and also volunteers for the nonprofit organizations Iraq Body Count and the Utility Organization. Daniel and Helen, welcome. Assyrian Studies Association is honored to have you both.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Good evening, everyone. Hi, Daniel.
Hi there, Helen. Thank you, Alexandra, for the introduction as well. I just want to also say that I'm in Sydney right now, and we usually just do a little call to country and just let everyone know that, where I live in the Gadigal territory, unceded and unbroken.
Okay, so first of all, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this, what seems and will be an exciting discussion, hopefully. We look forward to receiving your questions. So Daniel, I think you look into a very exciting and important topic, the remains of Assyrian identity, ancestral connections and archaeological excavations in post-conflict scenarios. Very heavy topic, loaded. Before we dive in, I would like to know, and probably you can share with us the background. How did you end up being interested in this topic, and what led you to research this topic?
Okay, thanks so much, Helen. Well, I was first, I guess, interested in this topic from my PhD research. So my PhD research looked at conflict and post-conflict scenarios. And in order to do that, in particular, looking at ISIS in northern Iraq. So the way that I went about that was looking at a geographical understanding of where conflict was happening, where the concentration of that conflict was occurring, how that was occurring was it recurring to areas which were predominantly of one ethno-religious group or another? So were there different cultural and ethno-religious concentrations to that violence? And also on top of that, were there sort of economic interests involved? So, in northern Iraq, oil is a big interest. So essentially I mapped locations of violence, locations of ethno-religious groups, and locations and centralities of oil infrastructure to see if over the conflict period, there were any correlations, rises and falls in the way that these things occurred. Obviously, during this research, very upsettingly, ISIS started destroying ancient sites, not only ancient sites, but also heritage and cultural sites all throughout northern Iraq. That made, quite a big impact on not just Assyrians, but also on the rest of the world. But also for Assyrians, there was this very strong emotional connection to it. So increasingly, I started looking at conflict and post-conflict through the lens of this archaeological damage that was occurring, the iconoclasm.
Wow. So you started looking at this, and it seems that cultural heritage came eventually, because it was at the beginning you were looking more at locations of oil. It was more economic, political centered, and then cultural heritage came into your research and topic. And I know that you've done remote sensing. You've used that for your mapping and as one of the methods that you've used. But also you've done actually field work. You were on the ground, and this is not many researchers can do that or have the opportunity to do that, be actually on the ground and see it for themselves and be in touch with people, which is a very important factor. Could you tell us how did you do that and how was it?
Well, okay. So this is a big point, and this really speaks to academic study, I think. My original plan for the PhD, I was in Vietnam at the time doing research there on conflict in northern Vietnam and the Chinese border. And I put in my PhD application to the university, as you do, and I got the acceptance to do 3 months worth of ethnographic research in Mosul and around and in the plains. And the day that they accepted it and they gave the scholarship and all of these things was the day that ISIS took Mosul, which obviously meant that my PhD was kaput. So I had to figure out ways to be able to do this. Now, as an engineer, mapping and data and technology, these kind of things come very naturally. And it's a way in which you can investigate a subject area without having to necessarily be on the ground, and for legal reasons and, for safety reasons, probably a good way to go about understanding the region. There were a lot of different methodologies being used that didn't require researchers to go into the field. However, the more I was writing about it and I was compiling these data sets on conflict, these different maps which showed where ethno-religious groups were, including Assyrian, Shabak, Yazidi, Arab, Sunni, Shia, and all the different oil resources, I felt I became more and more disconnected from the threads that connect communities, from the landscape of geography, which isn't just top down like a map is. They're horizontal, and they're zigzagging in there. They're sometimes a bit subterranean, and sometimes they're a bit all over the place. And there's no way you can get that from a map. And it's very hard to get that even from interviews and from discussions. There's something in the air that you have to smell. There's a grit in the dirt that you have to feel. The photo that's up right now is on the road to Nimrud. And as you were saying before we started, you don't get that sky out of the Middle East. You don't get that landscape anywhere but that. If I showed you that, you would have said to me, that's the Middle East. I know where that is. That's very hard for other people to know unless you go there and unless you spend the time. So I found a couple of NGO groups that were doing some humanitarian work during the humanitarian crisis, during ISIS, in particular with the Assyrian communities, but also some international aid organizations which I had some connections. And I just said, listen, I need to come. I need to have a look. It's very hard for me to write this PhD without actually talking to the people, without being on the ground and seeing what's up. So I went 3 times, once during the conflict of ISIS, one as it was tapering off. So once in 2015, once in 2017, and the next time in 2018. And that was very formative. So the first time it actually wasn't doing field work for the PhD, it was more sort of understanding it, which I think is very important for everyone to do if you're going to study a research topic. And if you're very passionate about something, it's put yourself on the ground there, even if it isn't contributing to your research project. There's something about smelling the air and the bread of the bakery and things like this. So, but after the many other times, I started really seeing the interconnections, and then the research started going into a different way. And that was because I saw the identity and the impact and the social implications that this conflict was having outside of the maps and outside of the vertical direction that I was forced to take during ISIS. So it sort of melded and it became sort of a mixed methods approach, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So where were you, if you don't mind, like, were you living among like Assyrian community? Were you more in a mix? Like, how did you see the impact? You said you start seeing it on their identity, so they expressed something to you. Could you elaborate a little bit about that?
First thing, the first time I went there, it was with an international aid organization, and I was centered in Erbil. But they were doing work in Shingal, they were doing work on the fringes of Mosul and Nineveh, towards the Nineveh plain at that point. And they had a lot of they were working in and out of IDP camps doing, they had health services running. So to begin with, I wasn't actually that exposed to the Assyrian community, mainly because I was there under the guise of an international aid organization. So I was saying, we were talking to Kurds, to Arabs, we were talking to, there were a lot of Yazidi that were in IDP camps. There were also Assyrians as well. So for the first couple of weeks I was there, and then it was, I had a few, family connections in Dohuk, and I ended up getting dropped off in Dohuk one day, and then I started, being a part of the Assyrian community, and not from a position of I'm trying to study you or I'm trying to figure out what it is your identity is, and because that's a very dishonest way of understanding of people. It was more because I was just interested on what was going on, and I was just trying to color my own understanding of the area. And what became apparent really quickly was that a lot of the conceptions of Assyrians in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, is that there's this big need. There's this big need, and that the Jihad, especially during ISIS, there's this whole, feeling sorry for people going through this. Now, yes, on one hand, it was a humanitarian crisis, but at the same time, the people over there are some of the strongest willed people I've ever met in my life. And they don't need anyone. But if you're going to go there and help and ask in a way, and that's polite to actually be a part of something, then they're the most open people I've ever met as well. And the way that they feel about Assyria, about the land, about the country, about the landscape, which have, been a part of for thousands of years, it's more than country, it's more than land. For me, it feels like what it's like here in Australia with the Indigenous peoples of Australia. It's the land means something to them, and to leave the land and to be someone who is, from a generation who has left and is coming back, it's almost like they're reintroducing you to yourself in that way. Mm. So they were helping me more than I was helping them. And it wasn't until I was able to get over that aspect of it I was actually able to do research, because the connections aren't just, and they're not just academic. They are, but they're sort of like they're horizontal and vertical. They really do fall underneath. This is why, critical engagement, I think, is a very important field, because normative understandings of the Middle East and of the way that ethno-religious groups attach themselves just doesn't fly. It doesn't work. What we do in the West doesn't work in that context. So you have to reimagine the whole thing, starting with the history. And I think that there's an Assyrian history that needs to be looked at. There's a Yazidi, there's a Kurdish history, and each one of those has its own narrative. Teasing out that, I think, would be the most amazing thing.
Yeah, so how long it took you? Because you said you went over 3 times. So when were you actually comfortable enough to start speaking with them about the destruction of cultural heritage and destruction of the Lamasus and Nineveh Wall, or everything? Like, when was that, and what did you get? Like, what kind? Yeah, could tell me more about that.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. So I'll flick through a couple of slides at this stage, at least. The Western conception of what Assyrian identity is, that it's a conception of all of these additives, correct? And I took this photo on my first trip, which was at Alkosh, in the mountains behind Alkosh at Robin Hurmus. And for me, like, there were all these different religious symbols that Assyrians sort of embed around. And it wasn't until the second trip it was at the first trip is when ISIS had destroyed Nimrud, but the Nineveh plains hadn't been taken back yet. ISIS was still a threat in that region. And the person that showed me around even said in the dark patch in that photo that's currently up, that's ISIS territory right now. So even these different sites that were controlled, there was no access to them. All that we were getting out was what the propaganda that ISIS were giving. So at that point, it was very hard. Also, people were dealing with the humanitarian crisis on the ground, which was, are we getting enough food? There's enough beds, there's enough shelter, are people, comfortable taking in families, like multiple families into their homes? Is there need to be a swap happening after a certain amount of time that people can stay sane in these kind of contexts? So it wasn't until actually the second time that I went and these sites had been, liberated, that I started seeing these sort of threads of these identities. So this photo is taken in Western Sydney, and we have, the Lamasu, and we have a very kind of Babylonian or Nineveh styled, castellated community center called the Nineveh Club. At the University of Sydney, we have these depictions of ancient artifacts of Gilgamesh. This was donated by an Assyrian community to the university. Genocide memorials. We have depictions of ancient artifacts. At our New Year's festival, this is in Fairfield. We have over 30,000 Assyrians come each year, and they take part in this kind of dress up of ancient cultural. And then in everyone's homes, there's always, these were taken in 6 different homes, and there's these different, little connections to ancient sites. So at that point, on the second trip, I went out there and I saw these sites with the help of, a very great friend, got me out there and to have a look at them. And this was in 2017, not long after they were retaken by ISF and the Peshmerga and collective forces. And it was devastating. It was devastating to see them in that condition. It didn't really, all photos that were coming out weren't real until it was seen. And the people that I was with, it then became the narrative. It then became my interviews. All my questions then just started becoming about that. And it was bizarre because Baghdad at the time, or Karakosh, everyone knew about it and were trying to sort of reshape their own lives back in their own homes. However, when talking about these sites, people were very emotive, and they were all trying to find little ways in which they could do their own thing. A lot of this time, in these ways, it sort of came up as reproducing. So Stavid, he's a good friend, and he's reproducing a lot of these ancient artifacts and trying to instill as much enthusiasm in Assyrians to reproduce, modern Assyrian sculptures and modern Assyrian reliefs. It doesn't take away from the ancient destruction. I hope that answered the question.
Yes. I'm curious about how did they express their connection to these sites? What did they think of their identity? How they see their identity linked to these sites? Because we always, not everyone, including myself, we don't have the chance to ask Assyrian community or members of the Assyrian community in Iraq and the Middle East such questions for many reasons, part of accessibility and so on. So I'm curious how they see their identity and how they see it linked to these sites. What did they answer? Oh, what was their answers?
There's a double-edged sword there, because on the one hand, you have people who are trying to deal with the humanitarian crisis. And also, one of the biggest questions I have, just sort of skirting backwards to the previous research, was how do you feel about this ISIS situation? What are you feeling now? And this was during the conflict. And the majority of the, answer went something like this. It's like, we're not scared of ISIS. They said, we're scared of after ISIS. And I teased that out sometimes, and there were different answers to it. But at the time, the concern wasn't just the humanitarian crisis that was going on and that ISIS was there, this large international boogeyman, which, the West is sort of, in my mind at least, helped perpetuate the narrative of as being, this international terrorist organization. But there was also this question of what's going to happen next? What's going to happen with our neighbors? What's going to happen with the government? What's going to happen with the way that we had been living for decades, and then prior to that for centuries, and prior to that millennium? How's that going to change? So when I was asking questions of ancient site destruction, at a certain age group, they weren't really that concerned about it. But in a different age group, younger age group, I'd say 40s and lower, people were, they were deeply attached to those sites, and they felt them within this sort of guise of artifacts of authenticity, that these sites scattered around, not just the ancient sites, but also churches and things like this, were the way that they were understanding themselves embedded into Atra. With a dwindling population, at least these are here. At least we have these, and at least that they're intact. So, there's a couple of respondent quotations I put up here now. They're like, it's my identity, it links me to Atra. The history proves who I am on the personal level. It's like, I'm not Assyrian, I haven't connected to those people, I haven't done my DNA or anything, but it's what I am, and it's why I'm crying when I see these sites are destroyed. Why are others not crying? And, to some extent, people in my department were extremely sad. They'd come up to me and say, I'm sorry, I've seen all these things destroyed. I'm sure it's a big part of you for this to happen. And the same is true there, if not more so, because of this fear of the future, because of this unknown in the future, because of the dwindling numbers there, and also a lot of the internal geopolitical pressures. It's very hard to sort of carve out your own space when the things around you that you identify with are also being destroyed as well.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. And also I would like to, I don't know if you explored this with them or with the people that you spoke and interviewed. How did they see their modern Assyrian identity linked to these ancient sites? Because, a lot has been said about the modern Assyrian identity, and there's not some literature, not much, but at the end of the day, it's about the people. So I'm always interested in how they see their current identity linked to these ancient sites, ancient relics, ancient churches. And I agree with you. I mean, we have churches in this region from 3rd and 4th century AD, so quite early. You did mention the land and basically the physical existence of these monuments and these sites. So there is the connection to the land, but I know Assyrian community think beyond the land, how their culture is linked to the ancient culture. Did they mention their language? Did they mention anything else? How they connect with these ancient sites?
Well, again, so I find that in the land, when you're in Atra, then the need to connect to, so for me, identity, I'll go back, I've listed here this idea of artifacts of authenticity. What that means is that there's a temporal and there's a geographic element to identity. And the further back you have something that you can identify with, the deeper your connection then resides in your modern experience. So the photos that I had put up earlier, this is one of the ways, at least in the West, that I understand Assyrian connection. It's that it literally dawns where we gather, where we learn, where we mourn, where we celebrate, and where we live. These connections, all these photos here were taken in diaspora, they were taken in Australia. And the point is very true. How do people in the homeland attach to these sites? Majority there's two different aspects. It's majority are connected to the religious sites, perhaps more. Younger people connect far greater to the ancient sites. However, access to them and education, bolstering that understanding, is also not forthcoming in the current education system. Understanding the way that these things are linked to the past, there was only 1 in 10 would really fully understand those connections. And part of the fear is that with the destruction of these sites and the management of these sites in the future, that increasingly those narratives may be stirred or may be turned from that Assyrian connection. And this is a fact with all kinds of archaeology and all kinds of iconoclasm, and the way that becomes nationalized after conflict. And that's one of the areas of study that I want to particularly look at, is that there isn't enough research being done on the ground in the way that people understand these ancient sites. Also, there isn't enough community and local engagement with these archaeological sites during those projects. It's during the projects that people need to be engaged, before and during. And once they're happening, people then show interest and they awaken within themselves the different things that may not have been at the fore of their understanding or at the fore of their interests, because, you know, dealing with the humanitarian crisis, dealing with shrinking lands, dealing with, you know, in a lot of Assyrian villages, the youth is leaving the villages. So it's up to the older generations to take care of the farms, which are increasingly in tatters. So the immediate concern of people out in the villages may not be these ancient sites. However, if they were occurring around them, which they do, they may have strong opinions about them because it reawakens this part of their identity, which gets pushed to the side. This is the problematic of dealing with archaeology in a post-conflict scenario, is that there are all these other different forces at play. A lot of the Assyrian NGOs that work in the space aren't really talking about ancient sites, even though they understand how important those ancient sites are to them. They're working on humanitarian issues because the villages, the connections between villages and the cities all need work in this period, and there are limited resources.
Mm-hmm. What about like international projects or and international NGOs and like university projects going back to these sites, doing restorations, reconstructions, or, you know, as simple as just surveying? Are there any contacts with local communities, Assyrian community?
Well, not to my understanding. There's one project that's being led by Benjamin Issakan from the University of Deakin. It's called After ISIS, which for me, it's the perfect name for a research project that tries to interview local populations to understand how they feel about heritage destruction. Now, on the one hand, that's a very good project. Gathering that data is a good point. It's getting from multiple different ethno-religious groups over multiple different, you know, over a variety of age groups, genders, all these different things that have a really interesting sort of cross-section of the way that people feel about these sites, about the destruction of the sites. However, people don't necessarily have it's not high up on their list, especially when they're dealing in a post-conflict scenario. Right now, infrastructure, resources, connection to water, electricity, homes, jobs are the most important things. So when you have those as your primary concerns, the impacts that they can have to archaeological sites is perhaps negative. In and around the walls of Nineveh at the moment, there's obviously a lot of development that's happening, and there's a lot of global outrage about that. But they are now at odds with the archaeological expedition and what the needs of the people are. Now, there are intelligent, you know, town planning and engineering ways to get out of this situation. As an engineer, I understand, multiple different ways to cut this. They may be a bit more expensive. However, there is a lot of international aid money that is going there. And unfortunately, there isn't enough engagement with the local population, with Assyrians in particular. And I think that, you know, your field in particular, which is like anthropology of archaeology, it is probably one of the most important aspects, which is being underutilized in Iraq, because the way that people engage with an archaeological site, the way they understand that archaeological site, the way that they're able to reimagine who they are and reaffirm who they are, that in a post-conflict scenario, once it's done and the archaeological team moves on, it's too late. Then the story is written. The journal articles have been published. The book has been written. The dig is filled up, and we're moving on to the next one. You know, and right now, this is something which involves us and involves our history, involves our identity. And You know, if you can see here, the respondent reactions to the destruction of these sites, you know, people were exceedingly upset about it, and they felt like a piece of themselves were lost in that rubble. And, you know, we don't have a lot of archaeologists like yourself. But we do have, you know, I'm seeing increasingly amount of interest in anthropology, in political science. And, you know, it is also the realm of political science to get involved into this, but to do it with an anthropological and an archaeological lens. So.
Yeah, the responses are devastating, but they're expected. And I think not only Assyrian community of Iraq felt in this way, actually all Iraqis felt like that inside and outside of the region. Also, I was wondering if you like these responses are only coming from Assyrians in Iraq. You have not worked with the people like in diaspora or in Australia. Like these responses are all from Iraq.
They're from Iraq and also from diaspora. So I did interviews from NGO workers who work in diaspora and who also work in the homeland. I didn't include any names because it's still a continuing project. And on top of that, NGO workers, they have to, although most of them didn't care if I put their name or not, but just from an ethical standpoint, I think it's very important that we make sure that these questions can become politicized very quickly, unknowingly and unwittingly. And to put people in, perhaps not in danger, but in, you know, to have their thoughts put there, to have that there, and then for that to then block future works that they may want to do, I think is important to keep anonymous in a sense. So it is yes, both. Definitely. I'd say about half-half.
Okay, fantastic. Because two
things. Very similar reaction.
Yes, and also two things I find in the Assyrian community is those who are in Iraq and the Middle East. So they are where the home is, where home is, whatever you call that home, Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan, you name it, whatever, that's home. And then also when they are in diaspora, then they're away from home, but they take home from them. And the objects that you just shared, that proves that I'm away and I'm here now. The United States is my home, Germany is my home, France is my home, but then this is who I am. So the culture, the heritage moves with them. And that's, I find it very strong, like among the Assyrian community. And I think that's how they maintain this connection. Even though some of them have never been to the sites, they've never seen them. But they feel the connection in there. Also, I want to say a small comment about what you described, the situation of the Assyrian community now, and being more concerned of their living, you know, food, home, water, power. This is all normal. This could happen anywhere to any community. We can see it, unfortunately, with our neighbor in Syria and Syrian people, and so on. But also what I want to point out is what's happening in Mosul. It's a bit promising, and it also reflects how eager Iraqis in general are to be engaged with their cultural heritage in post-conflict stage. And in Mosul, we know that Assyrian community of Mosul was driven out. I doubt many of them have went back. So Mosul, I don't think it still did not retain its Christian population at this point, but we have three projects of very big projects happening in Mosul: the restoration of Al-Nouri Mosque and the restoration of two churches. It took the UNESCO a bit of time until they understood that Iraqis have to be engaged in the restoration of their cultural heritage, no matter of their background, and it's happening. So it is promising. And I do know that Mosul have not reached, you know, their houses are all rebuilt, their roads are all nice, and no, but even though that is still difficult and they're still struggling with that, they are very like engaged with these projects. And I think if any project would approach a Assyrian community, even though they're struggling with their homes, power, food, and all that, they will be interested to be part of, you know, the whole thing, working with experts or even learning from them, or even sharing their perspective on the site, how the site looked like, how did they engage with the site, how should we reconstruct these sites? Should we or should we not, and so on. So I think they can be engaged even in this stage when they're still struggling. And we also see a similar situation with the Yazidis. So I would think that they're ready to be engaged with these restorations.
I agree.
Yeah.
They should 100%, and especially the youth. Assyrian youth in Iraq are so capable. I've never seen such capable, enthusiastic kids in my life. Like, I'm saying kids, I'm saying, you know, in their 20s and in late teens, early 20s, so enthusiastic. And they want to be a part of things, and they want to make changes, and they want to stay there, and they want to do things. They would be totally on board. The issue is that, as you're saying, is that who is the ones that are navigating the conversation for people then to take the Assyrian community's perspective into account in these projects? You're saying UNESCO does that with the mosque and the churches, and perhaps in these two churches. That makes sense. There's this religious connection. However, I haven't seen it with the ancient archaeological sites. You know, I think we were talking earlier about these three different zones. We have the international zone, where a lot of this different funding comes from. So we have international organizations to deal with heritage, conflict, and management. Then you have, you know, local governments and stakeholders and people who can, you know, provide access and connection to a lot of these things, and they can distribute funds on the local level. And then you have the local level. And I find that local level for these ancient sites aren't really being connected with. And on top of that, when they're happening, so once the decision to say, you know, to protect and to preserve Nimrud is happening, there isn't any research then on what the people in the local area think about that project. You know, because it's not just now that those archaeological sites are important, not now just to build the fences and to make sure that we clean up and, you know, protect and manage those heritage sites, but it's also how they're going to be caretaken in the future. Who are the caretakers of these in the future? And how do the people understand their position with these sites? So I think that Assyrians would be exceedingly enthusiastic, and not just Assyrians. I think Iraqis in general would be exceedingly enthusiastic in any kind of participation. However, it needs to come from a project as well. You know, the project needs to be there, and then people need to be engaged. And then I find that they would be exceedingly enthusiastic.
Yeah, definitely. So I think I haven't seen this happening in Iraq as it's happening elsewhere. So we have examples from Bosnia and the war in the Balkans. And when some of the sites were rebuilt or like restored, actually the communities were brought together. And the restoration of the site was used as a way of post-conflict reconciliation. And I would love so much to see that in Iraq, but we are not there yet. Most of the projects that are now working, especially in Mosul, they're not, it's pure academic, it's very Western approach. It's more, we're concerned with like we're not yet beyond the academic and then the state and then the people. We have not broken through the three levels. Like we really need to go beyond that and get to the people, and then how we can use these sites to rebuild the society itself. Because after all,
the purpose.
Yeah,
this is the purpose. Like when it comes down to it, and everyone who's here watching, like this is the purpose of why we research. This is the purpose of why, you know, we're archaeologists or anthropologists or sociologists, is that we're trying to get at something very visceral on the ground, you know, to make some kind of change through very in-depth intellectual teasing out. And I don't doubt that all of these organizations, international organizations who are putting a lot of money, the US government, the European Union Research Council, UNESCO has its own issues, but UNESCO and there's a bunch of different organizations such as, you know, ASOR and all the different university departments, they're coming at this from that perspective. However, once you hit the national level, you come from the international, you hit the national level. If there isn't then this engagement from from these academic departments to engage with the people, then you won't have this important movement between a reintegration of communities via its reconstruction and via its protection. Because as you say, there's nothing that's going to bind the community better than sites that were destroyed, that sites that were vandalized, that sites that were mistreated, misunderstood, and not educated enough over the last, say, since Saddam till now. They haven't been educated very much in the importance of these ancient sites. Without all of that, then you're not going to get anything more than a couple of papers out of it. And a lot of money funneling into the country, obviously, to protect the sites. So, yeah, I think that I would just, enthuse everyone to be able to do as much on the ground anthropological archaeology work that you could do, because it's one of the ways in which, even ideas of transitional justice can occur.
Yes, and I would like to add to that, Iraq is one of the best places to do community archaeology and use the cultural heritage to bring people together, because luckily, for once, all Iraqis do agree on the importance of this heritage, do agree on the importance of this heritage for them as Iraqis, and then as Assyrians, as any other community, Mindais, Christians, whatever. So they're connected in their own way to this heritage. And Assyrian is one of these communities that they're very out about it, that they talk about it, they express it, it's their identity, they're linked to it. And I think it's just, it needs to happen. It has to happen at some point. And yeah, hopefully in the future. Also here, I was just thinking as you were talking is, I think it comes the issue of scholars who are from this region, scholars who have a background in these communities, or as academics like to term them, heritage communities. So scholars who are from heritage communities, that's where the connection happens. That's where you can connect the community with the community beyond the political level, beyond the religious level, beyond the state. And then you actually are getting to the people, and then you're working with the people and understanding their perspective on this heritage and opening up the narrative to go beyond the usual colonialism, nationalism, and that's it, we're stuck in there. So we actually break through beyond that.
That's one of the issues, is that we don't have enough Assyrian academics from Iraq doing these important works. We do have, international scholars, even like myself, who do some research there, but unless you're there full time and you're engaging consistently, you're able then to engage with an intellectual community within Iraq, which has such a strong history. As you said before, the connection of, Iraqi archaeologists is very strong. They have a very strong connection to these ancient sites. One of the things we are missing is more emphasis on a local academics coming up. So any support we can give, and as I said, we have so many enthusiastic kids over there who would be completely into doing this stuff, but don't get a look in because of all the issues that have been occurring. So I guess one of the future projects should be is emboldening local Assyrian academics to be doing these kind of works, and now and over the next 5 years, because the opening up of a lot of these archaeological sites and the dealing with these post-conflict sites has a time limit. After a certain amount of time, like just in Bosnia and in the Balkans, that conflict management will cease at a certain point. And whatever the narrative will be, whatever the lessons learned would have been done by the people that were involved. And it'd be great to have some more Assyrians involved in that, so that at least the people there have a bit of pride as well, that the people that were connected to it came from our community.
I agree, but luckily we have Assyrian scholars in Western academia. So we have Assyrian scholars in the US, in Europe, in Australia, and they can work with these communities, and they can work through their universities with their colleagues, and then they can connect and engage the community. So that is there, that's available. I think just knowing myself and from my field and how we look at these sites, we're so concerned with let's map every single stone, which is important. Let's picture them, do the GIS map, do the thing. All that is important. But then at the stage beyond that, you need to understand this site with its people. Because for Mesopotamia especially, and I can talk for that, we do isolate the ancient heritage from the people, because that's how we are trained, that's how we're taught. And so far, I think slowly it's happening. More and more people are like, hey, wait a minute, let's see what these people have to say, or like what the site means to these people, why they care. So it's happening, but it needs to be more. We need to be open more to the public perspective, to the local perspective about these sites, I think. So I want to pay attention now to your slide. This is like a global initiative seeks archaeological sites. Okay, so this is still in Nimrud. Okay, so what is this? What's happening here?
So this is taken at Nimrud, obviously after the destruction. And, you know, I'm going to go through a couple of these because here we are. I'll go through some of these. We're a bit time poor, sorry. So we could talk about one of the important aspects of all of this is that exactly what you're saying, is that there's the modern Assyrian identity, modern Assyrian studies, which is what this whole association, what this whole group is trying to empower. Then there's this ancient archaeological Assyrianology discipline. And it's like really the connection between the two, the discombobulation of the two is a result of Western academic lines of thought. And I guess the more that we integrate those, the better. I'm being mindful of the time here, and I think that Alexandra is probably going to yell at us at some point. We could talk about this for hours, and I think this is the first of many conversations that need to happen.
Yeah.
And not just between us, but between other scholars to make sure that we're really engaging. But, you know, there are local NGO efforts that are occurring. And one of the things that we could be doing as scholars is going there and seeing what people are doing there on the ground. So this photo is taken at Nimrud, and this is a sculpture by Nino Stabid in Baghdad. And, you know, there are all these different art installations and art projects that Assyrians are trying to do, but there isn't a real engagement with the archaeological site. It's like we're recreating archaeological-esque sculptures and art projects because that's all that the community is able to do. We're not brought into these archaeological sites, and we're not really engaged. And I think that my future research in this area, really for at least the next 5 years, is for really, really plotting this out and to see the way that this occurs in post-conflict scenarios, because conflict in this sense is the catalyst that made a lot of this. It was important before, but it's almost a catalyst for the way that understanding and that connection can either be remade, rebuilt, and unified, as you said, or it can be broken and lost.
Yeah.
And for people who have this kind of feeling of, you know, this ethnic extinction kind of paranoia that we feel like, you know, that we're dwindling numbers in the homeland, this is one of the ways which we can engage and also find common ground with our fellow Iraqis.
Definitely. And I know we're running out of time, but really quickly, I have a little bit. Yeah, so really quickly, I want to ask you, what are your next projects? What are you working on now? So could you share with us some of what should we expect? Okay,
so I am looking at GIS of the, I'm not. So as a mapping person, I find that maps and photos, actually, you brought them up as, you know, that we need to go beyond them. But they are in and of themselves constructed elements in the way that we understand reality. So for me, maps and photos provide vertical and horizontal understandings or representations of life. And up until now, anything to do with photographics always comes from a forensic anthropological perspective, or anything to do with a map really comes from a strong political science objective basis. They don't bring into account the way that people feel about territory and the way they feel about the representations of the things in that territory. There's no participant-led GIS. There's no participant-led photography of these sites and of their own selves. And then on top of that, connecting those things through to an anthropology of archaeological sites an anthropology of post-conflict communities and the way that they can reharmonize and the way that they can be used as a vehicle for reharmonizing. So I guess over the next few years, I plan to do some more field work in Iraq, engage with a Assyrian community and other communities as well, to the way that they understand those archaeological projects that are happening, and also in the view of post-conflict scenarios, how they view the land and the different markers of authenticity and identity throughout those lands. So perhaps we could do something together, but we can talk about that at another time.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Daniel. Hi, Alexandra, over to you.
Hi.
Yeah. Sorry, we're over time.
I'm not going to yell at anybody. No, I just wanted to correct that.
There were more slides. We could go back now.
No, thank you both, Daniel and Helen, for your insight on Assyrian cultural destruction in Iraq and how we can really combat against this in the future. And definitely as a political scientist myself, I find this, I have a very strong connection to this type of information. And also, I want to thank you for educating us about this subject, because I feel like there needs to be a really huge voice presence about this. And I just want to thank you for being the person to do that. So we're going to now move on to the Q&A. I know we have a couple minutes left to spare. So a few people actually have a few questions. So I'll go ahead and read that. Let's see. So the first is not really a question, but it's kind of like a comment. If there's any citations to your work directly related to this subject, if there's any way that you could possibly send that out to our participants, because some of them are very interested. So Daniel and Helen, I know you guys do have that. So why don't you just email it to me and I can send an email out to everybody.
Perfect. Okay, we'll send it out.
Perfect. So the next question is about Assyrian continuity. So this person is mentioning that Assyrian continuity is an unbroken thread connecting ancient and modern Assyrians. Is still a conscientious topic in academia, with many experts segmenting modern and ancient Assyrians as desperate peoples. From what I can gather, some of your research positions continuity as a premise, and this is reinforced by some of the quotations from the interviews you have conducted. How was this premise received by our academic peers and instructors? I think
that's from Max Joseph, correct? Hey there, Max. It is a contentious topic, and it's one in which, unfortunately, isn't completely settled. I think that the majority of us come from that position as a given, and the more that we do, and the more that we try to re-engage with this idea of continuity, the less service that we do to ourselves. We're trying to get at here, different methodologies, and if we keep on hammering home at these issues of continuity, then we're just going to get stuck in this bubble. There's been some really strong research done from members, such as Sargon Donabed within this community, and I think that if we take that as where we are, and we take that as extant scholarship, and we move forward, then we'll be in a good position to do that, because at the end of the day, there's always going to be contention on the historiography of a people or their identity of where this goes. But I feel like at this point now, it's almost missing the point. And the more that we re-engage and refocus with a lot of really great academics who have already covered all of these topics, then the important work, which is what's actually happening right now, what the effects of the communities are now, how we can be a positive positive force for good in that area right now, almost gets lost.
So another question we have is, how did you react? I think both Daniel and Helen, how did you react when you heard the news about the destruction of these Assyrian cultural sites in Iraq?
Well, we talked about this the other day.
Who wants to go first?
You. I'll start only because
You go.
So I likened it to, well, actually Helen liked it. Essentially, it's the Assyrian 9/11, I think is what you said. And I remember exactly where I was. I was at the university department in University of Sydney, and I cried. And when I cried, when I watched those videos, I then wrote a very impassioned letter to an Assyrian nation, which was essentially a letter to all Assyrians, just letting them know how we should deal with this kind of blow. And like the annoying thing is it's still trying to be published. So annoyingly, no one got to read it, and hopefully one day they do. But all I wanted to do, I was, researching something completely different. And it just took the attention a different way. And it was extremely visceral. I think most people feel like that. What do you think, Helen?
Yes, definitely. I was at Columbia University, New York, and I knew a community of Iraqi professors at Columbia and Turkish colleagues and everyone. So you can see how everyone is feeling. So for an Assyrian to see that is horrifying, but also for all Iraqis, we couldn't believe it. Like for Iraqis, you would not, in a million years, you would not believe that one day you'll wake up and someone has taken a sledgehammer digging through these monuments. So that's in general. It's horrifying. And for me, it reminds me of the time of the day when the Iraqi museum was looted, because I witnessed that as well. And back then I was still in Baghdad. So these are events that, no, they scar you and they live with you. So, yeah.
And Daniel, are your interviews available to the public?
Not yet, for two reasons. Number one is that they are, it's an ongoing research project. So I haven't finished this one. And this one is detailed on NGO respondents to these questions. I'm not sure if I'm going to make them live. They're definitely going to be published, but I think that they're all very quite long, as you can tell. With a conversation with Helen, interviews with me usually go for 2 to 3 hours. So having all that data available, you have to get personal with people as well. And some of that information, I don't think that the respondents, or I would like to have made publicly available. However, I will be publishing it. So once that comes out, then I'll be able to do that.
Okay, I know we have a couple more questions that I don't think we're going to be getting to them all, but I want to cluster all of them in kind of one question. But this one is directly for Daniel. Where can we check out your photography series? Are they on your website? Because I know you posted some there.
Yeah, I have a website, so danieltower.com. So there are some photos there. I haven't really done a very good job of exhibiting these photos. I'll plan to. Actually, you've given me a bit of an incentive. So if you check over the next week, I'll publish a fair few more on my website. And from there, you can attach that to all the social medias. I have 0 social media. So don't have a Facebook, don't have a Twitter. Probably should, because maybe people are interested in it. But yeah, there we go. Over the next week, I'll publish more, but there are some there, including an interview with Ninos David, which actually has a lot of these photos, and I would actually really recommend. I may even put the link to that one in the chat, because that's a really beautiful little piece with Ninos. He's so capable, such an amazing artist, and also an amazing person. And I think that his connection to that makes the on the ground perspective that much more informative. And I think that if all I wanted to do was spend the rest of my life, trying to help people like Ninos and a lot of the younger kids there just get to whatever potential it is that they wanted to reach. And to find them doing that during a conflict, that's mind-blowing.
Okay, last question for today. Is there any plans that you know of? I'm not sure how well versed you are with the different types of plans that are currently happening about excavating certain sites that have been destructed. Is there any action or anything that you have heard of?
So excavating, yeah, so the sites that are being destroyed, they've been destroyed. Most of the work is basically to map them, survey, assess the destruction, and then look into what should we do, reconstruct the sites. It's much more complicated than just going back and rebuilding these sites. And there are different approaches, different opinions, different methods and schools of in academia and beyond. So there is that. Now I know in the case of Tel Nib Yunus, where the Mosque of Jonah was, and we all know that there is a whole Assyrian palace plus under that site that we know ISIS dug through the site and they looted artifacts, but we also know that German, I can't remember the university, there's a German team who's working there. They're doing some excavations, but I don't think it's like, I might be wrong, I don't think they're opening the whole site. There are excavations that are happening in Assyrian sites that were not destroyed by ISIS, but those are different parts. They're not in the Mosul area. There's one that is going on now, and I think it's getting a lot of attention. It's the archaeological site in Faida, which is being excavated by the Italian team in there. That's a very important and interesting site. For me, I would opt out. I'm a very strong supporter of preservation and conserving what we have on the ground before we start digging up new sites and exposing new material. And we all understand the situation of museums in Iraq. They're not equipped to take more material. So yeah, I think in terms of Assyrian sites, that's what I know so far.
Okay. Well, thank you both.
I think we need a whole other session. Sorry, Alexandra. I think we need a whole other session on repatriation of artifacts and.
Yeah,
I think so. Yes. No, I think we do need a part 2. So I think now we reached the end of the webinar. So I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who joined us today. In addition, I especially want to thank our speakers, Daniel and Helen, for their contribution to preserving Assyrian culture and heritage through their academic research and philanthropic endeavors. Before you all go, I just want to encourage you to subscribe to our email list and to our website and to follow us on our social media platforms to stay informed about our upcoming webinars, events, including also grant opportunities that we just closed, but future ones. And if you're interested in supporting Assyrian studies, we encourage you to visit our website and to make a donation to support our mission and to allow us to continue programs like this, while donations are tax deductible. Again, thank you, and we hope to see you in the future. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to everyone.
Thank you very much. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Alexandra. Peace, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.